All right. And we're live. I'm just going to share this on my personal page so all my friends and neighbors can have the benefit of hearing from you tonight.
All right.
We are live. Hi, Grace United Methodist Church and all our friends and neighbors. We are live with Dr. Jen Woolard, who Grace Church people know, especially 825 service, because she's one of our lay leaders in the congregation. And other folks might know her because she's a bell ringer in the congregation.
Yes.
But she's a woman with many gifts, and particularly I've wanted to talk to her because of some of her background and kind of where she sits and gets to see all of this pandemic going on. So Jen, would you mind telling us a little bit about your background and then tell us how you're holding up?
Okay, great. Thanks, Drew. Well, thanks for the invitation, and thanks everybody for being out there. It is great to be with you all tonight. My background is that I'm a psychologist, and folks who have heard me speak at Grace before know the next thing I say is, but not that kind of psychologist. So I'm not trained as a clinician. I don't do therapy. I'm not licensed to do therapy. I'm trained as a developmental psychologist. So I study kids and families, mostly kind of middle childhood and adolescence. And I have a background in community psychology as well, which focus on how communities respond and help people thrive and grow, or ways that they can change in order to do that better. So that's a little bit of a nutshell about me. In terms of holding up, thanks for asking. I think I'm doing pretty well. Maybe like some of you, it might depend on the hour or the day on how I'm feeling about things. But for the most part, I've been really lucky to be able to be in a job where I can work from home. I teach at Georgetown University. I'm a professor, for folks who don't know that. And so our transition and care for students, I think, has gone fairly well.
Good. Are there students at Georgetown now?
There are. We have about 100 law students and about 200 undergraduate students who, because of special circumstances, we're still housing them on campus, but we're having them follow all the guidelines about sheltering in place and so forth.
Yeah. Has that been stressful?
Well, I've been on a few calls with some of the folks that run the university, and I have to say, Georgetown is a Jesuit university, for folks who don't know that. I've been really impressed with the ethic of care for those students and the folks that have really been kind of scrambling to make sure, because then we have to feed them, and so forth, to make sure all the resources are in place to help them.
Yeah. And you're also a mom to a college student and a high school senior.
Yes.
And I know that it's had an impact on college students and high school seniors too, as schools are closed for the end of the year. We hope that they're holding up okay too.
Yeah. I think they're doing pretty well. They've probably gone through what other families have gone through in terms of a little bit of adjusting and grieving for the loss of what was expected for this semester, and particularly for my high school senior for graduation and all those kinds of things. But I think she's holding up pretty well.
Yeah, good. Well, everybody at church loves your family. You're major leaders throughout the church, and we give thanks for you and thank you for being around tonight. I'm wondering, the governor made some announcements today, which I listened to most of, but then my daughter's computer lesson from school ended, and so I had to she wouldn't let me do any more work, so I turned away before I heard the whole thing. But let me check my summary with you. Did you get to watch it?
I didn't, but I got some summaries of it after.
Well, and I read one article, so that's just our disclaimer at the beginning of it. That
we're good to go. This never gets in the way of me talking about things, so okay. We should be fine.
So it sounds like what were guidelines about not meeting in groups larger than 10 persons and maintaining social distance of around 6 feet and only doing essential trips out and only essential businesses operating. All of those guidelines have now been turned into an official order from the governor, which is enforceable to the point of a misdemeanor. But it sounded like from what I heard, he was saying like, look, we don't want to send anybody to jail. We just really want you guys to take this seriously.
Yeah.
And that order is now officially going to June 10th.
Yeah, I think that's what I heard as well.
And so what's your reaction to all of that?
Well, I'm not that kind of doctor either, the medical doctor, but that won't prevent me from offering my opinion. I think it wasn't unexpected, I think, given everything that's been happening across the country and what DC and Maryland were doing and so forth. And it seems like in part it's in response to, the psychology of trying to encourage people to engage in behaviors that we need them to do to protect the whole community, even though it might be challenging and limiting for us as individuals, right? So it's really trying to, I think, another way to encourage / coerce folks into thinking about the broader community health, which ultimately benefits all of us, even if the short term it feels really limiting, or maybe it feels unnecessary to some folks who aren't really seeing the day-to-day, tragedies and stress that are happening in various parts of the Commonwealth.
Yeah. Another thing that kind of came through to me from what I did hear from the governor was that a lot of it is kind of an act of defense on behalf of the hospitals, who
Right.
we know are going to be overwhelmed. That this is a way to let the hospitals and the medical professionals do their work under the most reasonable circumstances we can give them.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. And Will and I have lived in a bunch of different parts of Virginia over the course of our lives, and so I've experienced some of those less resourced places, right? So yeah, I think part of it is trying to shore up or give them the time and the capacity to be able to respond appropriately.
Yeah, yeah. So, so you mentioned some of your research and understanding about community psychology, and in an earlier interview when you were, I think, commenting, you helped introduce the term to me, I think, of something like community trauma, or something like that. But I wonder, how can you help us, or can you help us understand the psychological impact of this on our community? And that could mean, our church, our neighborhood, our region, our nation, or the world, because everybody's being impacted. But what light can you shed on what this means for our community?
Yeah, well, I think we can think about a couple of concepts that come together here, right? And as community psychologists, we think about both the traditional kind of psychology of the stereotype of thinking about the individual, but then we try to think about it at a larger level, at a community level too. So I think that's what you were referring to. So I think some of the key concepts that we can talk about here are stress and coping, clearly, which can happen at individual level, family level, community level. I think trauma, which means different things to different people, right? And we can think about resilience and thriving, right? So I always like to talk about thriving and coping if I'm going to be talking about stress and trauma too, right? Because they kind of go hand in hand, or we hope they go hand in hand. So I guess one thing that I want to say is that, that communities do experience a collective sense of stress and trauma and coping, right? And resilience and thriving too. So I think part of what I want to say is just it's important to acknowledge that, right? That we're not just a collection of individuals, each experiencing our own thing. But part of how we are able to cope or not, or thrive or not, depends on the collective, right? And this is getting back to that collective good I was talking about before. Social psychology can teach us that one of the better ways to motivate people to engage in these kinds of behaviors is to appeal to the benefits of the common good, right? That we're coming together to do something that's going to help everyone else, rather than focusing on what we as individuals can't do, right? That I can't go out to a restaurant or something like that. The other thing that I want to say about that, and focusing on the strengths, is that even though I think there is a stereotype and sometimes a focus in the media on the negative things that some individuals do in communities when communities experience trauma, or distress or disaster, the vast majority of people step up to the plate, to use a baseball analogy, right? And are helping and are positive and are trying to look out for neighbors and so forth. So I just want to emphasize that while we're experiencing trauma and stress, that there are a lot of people, many grace people included, I think, that are doing good things and trying to be helpful and trying to think of others in addition to themselves. Um,
Can you
Go
mention a
ahead.
couple specifics about like what is it? I just think it would be helpful to hear you articulate. What are some of the ways that we're that this is showing up as stress, or how we are coping as a community? What are you seeing that's like, yeah, that makes sense, according to stress, or oh, look, that's an effective way of coping? Like, are you noticing anything in particular about how we're going through this yet?
Um, I think that some of the examples that I've seen in our grace community and our larger community, right, are people recognizing the importance of staying connected, and being proactive about that, right? So, for example, I'm used to seeing a lot of people at 8:25 every Sunday, and that's the way I connect with them, right? I can't do that now. So I realize I need to be more proactive in reaching out to folks that I might not otherwise during the week, or something like that, to make a deliberate attempt to try to connect, not just to see how people are doing and if I can help, but just because we both benefit from that connection, right? In and of itself, and just that sharing. Um, when and when I am not feeling good about the way things are going, it may be that whoever I'm connecting with is at a point where they are feeling good and coping, and so we can benefit from each other, right? In that way. Certainly examples of folks marshaling resources to offer to get groceries for folks who can't leave, right? To be really aware of folks in our grace community and our neighborhoods that have particular challenges, either health wise or otherwise, and offering to do things for them. The teachers that are doing the car parade through the neighborhood for the kids, right? To stand out and wave and do things like that. So, those are some of the ways I think that communities are coming together, right, to do that, and maybe organizing over social media or other ways, um, to be able to provide some coping strategy or some relief or something positive to help people um, come out of that stress, right? I think as individuals, we know this, and I think as communities, we can do that sometimes too. We can get in what we call a vicious spiral, right? Where we're kind of going down, right? We're focusing on the negative, which makes us think more about the negative. And then we look for stories that reinforce the negative, and it can be hard to break out of that sometimes. So some of these deliberate attempts to rethink or reframe can help us stop that, right? And kind of change how we're thinking in that moment, and not to keep going down into that negative spiral.
Yeah, so as the kids say, I feel seen when you talk about that downward spiral.
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
I kind of yesterday I was listening to a podcast that was a wife telling the story of her caring for her husband who has the virus and is
yeah,
not well, uh,
yeah,
and uh, and that just got me to a really scared, dark place pretty quickly. And then,
yeah,
but you're right that I then felt like okay, so my way of coping was I just need more information. So I started looking for more stuff, and
right,
and it's never the hopeful information that's out there. It's the worst case scenarios and all that stuff. So yeah, I definitely feel like that's a thing that happens. But it's also this awkward thing that I've heard people talking about, where when you're not actively consuming that kind of information or media or whatever, and you're just going about a bit of your daily life,
yeah,
uh, it feels so normal,
yeah,
and yet it's in the context of this whole
yeah,
other reality. Uh,
yeah, yeah. I think it's okay to have those normal moments, right? I mean, um, part of coping is managing, right, that adrenaline or stress or negativity. And one of the things that we talk about in terms of kids, but it's true for adults too, is when we're experiencing that anxiety or that kind of spiral, one of the strategies is name it and tame it, right? Which is to sit down, to pause and reflect on what you're actually concerned about, right? So like when you were talking about listening to that story, right? Are you concerned that you might get sick yourself, that someone in your family might, that you're not going to be able to get the resources that you need in order to survive, really? And just kind of, you can take some control over those feelings by kind of pausing and just consciously thinking through, what is worrying me right now? I was saying this to my daughter the other day, earlier today, right? What are you feeling right now? Right? And even writing that down can help give that a structure, right? Just by writing it down. And then thinking about how likely is it that those things are going to happen, right? And just be able to kind of pause and reflect on that. I think we can kind of do that as a community too. And I think you and Pastor Janet actually have done a nice job of kind of putting a little structure in our weekly worship about kind of what our concerns are and the kinds of things that we can do going forward to help manage those concerns, right? As a community, focus on the fact that we're still connected and those kinds of things that can help us. But that name it and tame it, I think, is a really nice strategy when that cycle is going, right? And then when you're looking for those stories, for example, right, to hit pause, right, and step back. But it can be really hard to do.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
One thing that's been interesting for a lot of folks who are parents or grandparents who are caregivers for children is to try to figure out how to help our kids experience this or not experience this,
right.
To shelter them or usher them into this new reality that we're making up as we go along, and figuring out how to talk to our kids. We're not we don't have a playbook for this. And there's not much of a playbook for most parenting, but we can't call our parents or aunts or uncles and say, what did you do when there was a massive pandemic and your kids were home for half a year?
Right.
I wonder if you could share some ideas about how to talk to kids about this, our kids or neighbors or what have you.
Sure. I'm happy to do that. And I'll say that I'll send some links to resources that we can post on the Facebook page and so forth for folks, right? Because they're actually, the psychology community and other communities, I think, have really come together well pretty quickly to offer what I think are some understandable resources for parents, right, on how to do this. So I guess one of the first things I'll say before I get to how to talk about it is that in really stressful times, kids, kind of no matter what age they are, really want to know three basic things, right? One is, am I safe as a kid? Two is, are you, the people caring for me, safe? And the third is, how is this situation going to affect my daily life? Right? And those are kind of the three main things for kids. It's probably true for us as adults too, right?
Our 5-year-old, that's totally the most important thing to her is like, is this going to mess up dessert? Like, am I going to be able to get dessert?
Look, there are moments when I feel that way too. but it helps to think about, right, that from their perspective. So and I'm pulling resources from people who are a lot smarter than me, and do clinical work on like how to help kids, right? So let me just give you a couple of them and you can jump in and ask questions or whatever as we go. One of the first ones, which can sometimes be the most challenging, is for us as parents to get a handle on our own anxiety, right? And so that can include getting credible information, like we were talking about before, talking with folks who support you, right? So the conversations you can have with other adults or parents. The other thing is, if your child asks you if you are worried, be honest with them. I think most parents know that pretty early on, kids figure out when we're not telling the truth or when we're hiding something. Of course, that has to be age appropriate, right? And how you talk about them. But for example, if a younger kid asks if you're worried about what's happening, you could say something like, yes, I'm worried about the virus, but I know that there are ways to prevent its spread and take care of the family if someone gets sick, right? So you acknowledge those feelings and worries and say what yours are, but then you also give them a sense of how we're responding to it, right? Or coping with it. Now it's going to be different from a 2-year-old than a 17-year-old. And some of the links that I'm going to give for us to look at later are oriented to, here's how you talk to a preschooler, here's how you talk to a young kid, here's how you talk to a tween, so they'll be specific. And not only how to talk to them, but how might they be manifesting stress and anxiety, right? Which is different across the ages too, right? Acting
Yeah.
out can be anxiety, withdrawing can be anxiety or stress. So it helps to have, I think I really appreciated reading those different resources. So I'll offer some of those up. One way real specific about talking to your kids can be to ask them what they know, right? Or what they've heard, and to ask it in an open-ended kind of way, right? Like, well, what have you heard about the virus? Where did you hear this, right? What are you worried about, right? And let them articulate for you. Do you have any questions I can help you answer? I think sometimes, at least for me as a parent, I'll project on all parents, my own parenting now, is that I feel like I need to come at them having solved everything and having an answer to make them feel better, right? And sometimes I skip over the step of just pausing and saying, what do you know, right? And what are you thinking about? And what's worrying you, before I'm like, here are the things I assume are worrying you, and here are the 4 things that we're going to do to solve that, right? Which eventually means they don't have to be involved in the conversation at all, because I'm just talking at them, right? So those are some things, and validating their feelings and concerns, and being available to talk to them. This is not a single conversation that's going to be happening, right? This is going to be over time, and they're going to be learning more, just like we are, as things go forward. I guess 2 other quick things, and then I'll let you talk and ask questions more. Or 3 things. One is, we can empower them by modeling the behavior that we hope that they will engage in, not just hand washing and singing, right? But for example, not blaming others for the problems that folks are facing, right? We have a tendency to do that in stress. And the last thing I guess I would say that I've culled from other people is that you can provide them some reassurance, right? So if you can think about a time in the past when your family has faced a stress or a challenging time, right? Kids love stories, right? So you can say, remind them of a challenging time that you all have been through before, and point out, although everybody was distressed, we worked together and we got through it. That's not to say everything's fine and perfect afterwards, right? But you're trying to model that we can face challenges and work through them and come out on the other side. So let me stop there and let you ask questions or talk or ask other
Yeah,
things.
that's all really helpful. I'm gonna go back and rewatch this to
Well, I'm gonna
for
give
myself.
some documents,
Yeah, that's
that
good.
have that.
We'll make sure that we
Yeah,
include those afterwards. We'll update this
yeah,
video, and we'll try to include it in our emails to the church as well. Uh,
great, great.
I right now, since things have been changing so fast, I think that there are families out there, so in our family, we haven't talked about it a ton, because the kids haven't brought it up that much, and it's
Yeah,
been changing every day.
yeah,
So, so one question I have is, do you feel like, uh, when's the time, if we haven't
yeah,
had like the sit down, okay, we're going to have a more comprehensive conversation here. This is a thing that's not going away.
right,
Should we have done that by now? Should we do it now? Well, how do we
yeah,
know when it's time to have the family meeting to say,
right,
this is our family on coronavirus,
right, right, right. Um, it's so hard to say that there's a right answer or wrong answer. So I feel like if you haven't talked about it yet, it's going to be okay, right? And it's fine. But probably most kids of most ages may have thought about it at least a little bit already. And I guess one piece of advice is, don't wait for them to bring it up, right? Like if they bring it up, that's a great moment to have a conversation, but it doesn't have to be a, now sit down and we're going to have the conversation about the virus, right? Right. You can do that in informal ways, and take advantage of the circumstance if they bring it up, or something is on the TV as they walk through, right? Or you learn that someone that is sick, right? Or something like that. Um, I would, I'd start that talk with those open-ended questions, right? Like, what do you know? What have you heard? Are you worried about something? Um, and um, and make sure that they know that you're available to talk about this when they're ready to talk about it too, right? Um, so that you're open and available to talk about it with them when they want to talk about it. But check-ins are good, particularly as we're getting into like, middle school and high school and so forth. Just thinking about a regular check-in, it doesn't have to be Thursday at 10, we're going to check in about how you're feeling, but being proactive about connecting with them. Or, like today, when I just flopped on my daughter's bed and was like, how's it going? What are you thinking about?
Yeah.
A range of things come up. And it might be you can use that and something about the virus will come up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
As you're talking, I guess I have a request for one more document if you've got it in your bag of tricks.
Sure.
And that would be something about kids in grief.
Yes. Yeah.
Because it's already like, so last night, John Prine, the singer-songwriter, his family sent out a note that that he's not doing well. He's got the virus and he's not doing well. And I was shocked at how hard that hit me.
Yeah, right.
Would not have seen that coming. Like I like him. I think he's really important. I really value him. I'm not his number one fan. Like there's other people who are way more into him, but like hearing, like having the virus connected to that person hit me.
Right.
Right. And I'm just kind of aware that it's probably going to get even closer to my own family or my own community. So as a pastor, that's part of what I'm thinking too, is how we can be prepared to grieve well. And so maybe if you could include something about kids in grief.
Sure.
Because I think sadly that's probably part of what we're going to be facing.
I think so too. And maybe also this notion of anticipatory grief, right? Like expecting it to happen or waiting for it to happen and starting already. Particularly as we hear, some children, unfortunately, right, are becoming sick and not doing well too. So I'm happy to share some things like that. And also just to say what you just described, is not unusual or abnormal in the sense that you were surprised that it's this person that somehow it hits you in that way. I don't think that's unusual for that. It doesn't have to be just people that we know really well or that we even know a lot about, that can bring home for us in some way, right, the reality of what's happening to so many people.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
You started out talking about the importance of including coping and resilience as we talk about stress and anxiety. And I wonder if you could offer some practices for resilience, whether they're for kids or anybody, because the longer this goes on, the longer it seems like we'll be dealing with it. So, what resources or ideas can you offer us, things to keep in mind about how we cope and how we engage in practices for our own resilience and the resilience of our family or community?
Yeah, sure. One thing that I would say, I guess, is that most children, and I think this is true of adults too, right, eventually return to their typical functioning, right, after having gone through a stress or a disaster or even a trauma, when they receive consistent support from sensitive and responsive caregivers, right? So don't underestimate the importance of simply being present for your children and being supportive, and for each other as adults too. It is true, I do want to point out that for kids and for adults, that folks who have prior trauma, right, or pre-existing situations like mental or physical or developmental problems may be at greater risk, right? They're carrying a little bit more with them as we move through this period. And so So we do want to pay special attention, I think. We don't want to pathologize or say, because of this, we know you will be this, but just to be aware of that reality that some folks are come into this situation with some challenges already. And so we want to be mindful of that. In terms of kids, and then I'll talk about some practices we can all do. One thing that I read that I thought was really good by a psychologist was to be mindful of the 3 R's. And this is a different 3 R's than when we grow up singing, reading, writing, arithmetic. This is for kids: reassurance, routines, and regulation, right? So reassurance, like I was talking about before. The importance of routines, and it doesn't have to be the routine. I don't know if you guys have seen this circulating, right? The like scheduling every 20 minutes to make it look like a school day or something. It doesn't have to be that routine, right? You can create a new routine as a family, but having something regular and a structure as best you can is good. And then regulation is talking about helping them manage their response to stress, right? Which can be some different kinds of techniques, can be taking a break. You've all probably heard what is now, I think, kind of standard on thinking about responding, which are things like eating well and exercising, right? Maybe just around our house now that we're all on shelter in place, or around our apartment. But exercise is good. Paying attention, being present in your body. So I know Pastor Janet is really great about helping us in worship think about our body and where we are and doing physical and corporal kinds of worship. Breathing. It sounds kind of silly. And breathing's not silly, but thinking about breathing as a strategy. And one thing that I've found helpful and that doctors and other folks use, I don't know if you've heard of it, the 4-7-8 breathing. Have you heard of this, Drew? The idea is that regulating our breathing can really help, the adrenaline and the stress that comes up. Just the way we breathe can help give us that pause, like we were talking about in that spiral. I was reading today where a doctor was suggesting this to a patient that was having real anxiety. And she did this breathing exercise and said, wow, that's kind of like Valium. So I don't want to promise it's like Valium, and there are different ways to do this, but the 4-7-8 breathing, and if you guys want to do it with me, we can now. I'll say it first, is to inhale from your belly, right? So not like your surface chest, but to have what we call a soft belly. Inhale for a count of 4, and then hold your breath for a count of 7. It can be a quick 7. And then exhale slowly through your mouth to a count of 8, right? So you would breathe in for 4, 3, 4, and then hold it if you can for 7, which just makes you pause for a couple seconds. And then breathing it out for 8 and really taking a moment. I don't know, you could probably see me going like this, like I could feel myself relaxing just a little bit. And I'll post a handout that's for kids that has like little frogs that shows you how to do this breath or something like that. But that can be a really simple way to help kids and adults just take that moment to breathe and realize, for me, I carry my stress in my jaw and my neck and my shoulders. Other people may tense up in different ways. But it actually literally, what we say, down regulates our system, right? When our response to stress is up, it helps bring that down just a bit. And that can help us have kind of a clearer head and a little bit of a pause to have a sense to maybe address those questions like, what am I worried about right now, right? Something like that. So those mindful practices can be really helpful, I think. The other thing I want to say that I read today that I felt was really helpful is when we get those lists like exercise, eat right, do this, for some people that's really helpful. For others, you can think, great, now I've got 5 other things on my to-do list and I'm not doing any of those well either. That's an okay feeling. And so you can have other coping strategies that, as long as they're not harming you, can be okay, right? I don't bake, stress baking is a thing, right? Or it can be watching TV, right? It can be any of these kinds of things that just give you that little bit of a pause. And I think, like you were saying before, Drew, to feel okay to not think about the stress for a little while. That's okay. We don't have to be on alert 24/7. Yes, there are really stressful things and really bad things are happening to people. It's okay to take a little space from that to recharge yourself to be able to then come back into it.
That's awesome. Thank you. That's you packed a whole lot in there, and a lot that people can take and use immediately. And I feel really glad that that you're able to offer these gifts to our congregation and anybody else that's watching. That's to me, that's a way. Well, early on in this whole thing, somebody said, it's times like these where if you've got a gift, you better use it. And I think that that's you're an example of that tonight. So thank you very much.
Oh, sure.
I want to ask one more question, and that's what's this doing to or for your Christian faith? How are you experiencing your Christian faith in the midst of it? Because I know you're not a clinician, but you have knowledge to think about this intellectually and scientifically and practically, and but I wonder what it's like for you theologically and spiritually.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And again, it can be like the hour or the day that you ask me
Sure.
in terms of how I might respond.
Sure.
In some ways, I think it's strengthened my faith in a couple senses. One is that I find myself much more in need and attached to those routines, like the daily Bible reading that we're doing on Facebook. Plug for that if you want to join us in that group. We'll drop the link or let you know. And reading our devotionals for Lent, right? I miss that even more, I think, now if I find that I haven't done it in the morning. And my faith is strengthened by folks in our community as they respond and lift us up, right, in their perspective. But I do have to confess, there are times when I'm heading in that kind of spiral that it really challenges me, right, with all of the bad that's happening, to deliberately come back and attach, right, to that faith, to attach to that hope, to recognize that some of the challenges we face are certainly not God's doing, they're people doing, right, in terms of how we respond and so forth, and to take some agency and ownership over that. Yeah, so that's kind of where I am in a messy little description of how I've been thinking about it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And same.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm having a similar experience.
Yeah.
There was this one video that somebody shared. I didn't even watch it. I just watched the captions, but it was a bunch of folks singing "He's Got the Whole World in His Hands."
Yeah.
And phrases like that talk about who God is and how God is and what God's up to. They keep coming to mind, and then the next phrase that comes to mind is "That better be true."
Yeah. Yeah.
And
yeah.
And so seeing evidence of people of love and good and grace in the world helps.
Yeah.
And I think that that's also just kind of my prayer, even in the spiral times, is look,
Yeah.
God, what you've said is true, better be true.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and we have to act like it is, right? I mean, we have to believe that it is.
Yeah.
It is, and so we have to believe that way.
Right. I believe, help my unbelief. Yeah. That's
right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that that's kind of part of God's role in this is to also give us those 3 R's as God's own children.
Yeah. Right.
Is that reassurance and the routine.
Right.
That's that routine of prayer is part of what the church also gives us. What was the third R?
Regulation.
Yeah.
Right. That ability to regulate,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And so any of the spiritual practices that you engage in can help be that regulation too, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, if we were in person and having a beverage, I'd say cheers, and I could keep talking to you about this stuff for a really long time. But you've had a full day, and so I'm going to
So
let
have
you
you.
go. Yeah.
Yeah.
But thank you for your ministry to us tonight.
Yeah. Well, thanks for asking. It's really a great opportunity just to be able to. I think it's great that you and Janet are creating a space for people to think and talk about this, right? This is a pause in and of itself to be able
Yeah.
to have the different people speak that you've had. So thank you for that.
Yeah. And so maybe when folks stop watching this, we could all do a quick 4, 7, 8.
Yeah.
And turn to something that reassures us, or a bit of routine, or a
Yeah.
bit of something that can regulate us, so that we can rest tonight in peace.
That sounds good.
Thank you for being our teacher and minister tonight.
Thanks
God
for
bless
joining me and asking me.
you. Yeah. And everybody's
Yeah.
watching, God bless you. Talk to you soon. Good night.
Good night, everybody.